welcome to another episode of Dr. Doctor, the award-winning radio show and podcast featuring your physician hosts, Dr. Tom McGovern
and Dr. Andrew Mullally, where we and our guests discuss relevant and health-related topics from an authentically Catholic perspective. Dr. Doctor is brought to you in part by the generous underwriting of CMF Curo. Learn more at mycatholichealthcare.org. Live your Catholic faith in your healthcare with CMF Curo.
Today, our guest will be heard across the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Joining us will be Father Philip Bochanski, Executive Director of Courage International, to talk to us about same-sex attraction. Andrew, what makes this topic so important for our listeners?
I think it's really important. I think it's important because it's a topic that many people, I think, are thinking about and not necessarily everybody's talking about. It's intimately related to healthcare and to our faith, and it's something that's becoming, more common if we look at the statistics. We've tried to address similar but different things on the show in the past.
Right.
We had Dr. Paul Hruz, a doctor of psychology, pediatric endocrinologist, talking about gender dysphoria, among other episodes we've had.
Yes, and then a psychology PsyD, doctorate, Andrew Sodergren, talked about especially rapid onset gender dysphoria, but from the psychologist viewpoint, whereas Paul Hruz was great. We've had him on twice now, just about the harms of trying to block puberty or do surgery to change the outward appearance of people.
Yes. And so these are things that are becoming a bigger and bigger part of healthcare in America. And so we wanted to address it on our show, and we could think of nobody better than our guest today to help us do that.
Oh, absolutely. And Andrew, there's a quote you really like from the USCCB on this topic.
Yeah, I think to kind of set the stage, the USCCB did a good job, and kind of where we're coming from is that they say the church seeks to enable every person to live out the universal call to holiness. Persons with a homosexual inclination ought to receive every aid and encouragement to embrace this call personally and fully. This will unavoidably involve much self-mastery and struggle, for following Jesus always means following the way of the cross. The sacraments of Eucharist and penance are essential sources of consolation and aid on this path. And so that's the kind of where the USCCB and the Catholic Church in America and we on Dr. Doctor are trying to come from in finding the best way to reach out to our brothers and sisters in Christ who have, same-sex attraction.
And you found some great statistics, some information. It's interesting that from 2012 to 2022, where we are now, the percent of U.S. adults who identify as something other than heterosexual has doubled, 3.5% to 7.1%.
Yeah, it's really incredible. It's escalating, and it's going at a rate that, I've seen even in secular media sources, people are commenting on this and saying this does not necessarily appear to be organic for it to be increasing at such a rate. And it's even more noticeable when you look at the different generations. So when you look at, these are from Gallup polls, these statistics, but if you look at baby boomers, about 2% or 2 people out of 100 would identify in the LGBT community. However, when you look at the Generation Z, the folks born between 1997 and 2002, 16%, 15.9% of people identify as other than straight heterosexual. And so this escalation is quite remarkable. What's behind it? What does it mean? How can we be available to help these people?
Well, what surprised me even more was that of this group that identifies as other than heterosexual, the biggest group, over half, was not what I would have expected. It was
Yes.
under the LGBT, it was the B.
Yes,
the bisexual.
I think, traditionally, or I say traditionally, you look back 30 years and people think of the terms gay and straight, and that kind of dichotomy is almost gone, and now the push or the way it's being defined on questionnaires and whatnot is more of a spectrum, and you get the LGBT, even other acronyms that include more different varieties of non-heterosexually inclined people. It's really incredible. The bisexual folks are more than half of them. So that the idea, we're talking primarily today about same-sex attraction, but really looking at this group as a whole, it's an interesting group.
And it's fascinating how U.S. support for legalized same sex so called marriage changed in the 25 years after 1996, from 27% support in 96 to 2020, where two-thirds of people supported it. So I can't wait to explore some of this with Father Bochanski.
Yeah, in kind of reviewing and preparing for this show, one of the things that struck me also is not only the amount of people that identify in this way, the public support, but also kind of the influences there are on children regarding this. I found an interesting article about a kid who talked about growing up in Maryland in a very diverse public school in Montgomery County, Maryland, where they taught about sexual orientation and gender identity in health class. And uh, their comment was, at that point, I was already very familiar with this stuff that they were teaching at 14. So it's kind of old news. And so we think of these things as, I don't know, maybe some folks might consider themselves insulated from these things or really engrossed in these things, but 93% of counties in America, in every state, have households that list a homosexual couple as the head of household. So it's really something that's growing and is in every part of our country. And we want to be able to hear from Father today about his experience with this community.
Amen. But before we go there, as you know, we have a medical trivia question of the day. Category I chose for this one is testosterone. So in adulthood, how much higher are testosterone blood levels in men compared to women? And it's a multiple. It's not just a percent, but it's a multiple. What is that multiple? And is a bonus question. In what organ of the body is the vast majority of testosterone produced in men, and in what organ in women? You have to wait around to the end of the show for the answer, but we'll be back with our special guest, Father Philip Bochanski, here on Dr. Doctor after the break. Welcome to that part of the show when we bring on our special guest. Tonight, that's Father Philip Bochanski. Father Bochanski is the executive director of Courage International for the last 5+ years. Before that, he was chaplain for the Courage Apostolate in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia for 5 years, and he was appointed associate director at Courage in 2015. He is an award-winning author. He's written and edited several books, audio series, and articles in various aspects of church history, catechesis, and spirituality. And in 2019, Pope Francis awarded Father Bochanski the Cross Pro Ecclesia et Pontifice in recognition of sustained and exceptional service to the church. Father, welcome to Dr. Doctor.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you.
So what got you interested in this apostolate of Courage RC?
Well, like many of our chaplains, I never went looking for it. When I was in the seminary, Father John Harvey, who was our founding director and happened to be from my home Archdiocese of Philadelphia, he would come to the seminary once a year and come to our moral theology classes. So if I knew then what I know now, I would have gotten to know him a lot better. But anyway, I was aware of the apostolate and certainly respected the idea of it, but it wasn't ever something I thought I'd get involved in. But what happened was the local chapter in Philadelphia, their chaplain was he was a Redemptorist priest, and so he was moved by his order to a different house, and they didn't have anybody to send in his place, and the other priests in the parish were very busy, so they couldn't continue as the chaplains, and happened that one of the lay leaders of the group was a parishioner of mine, and he asked if I would be willing to help out. So I did that kind of tentatively at first, to be honest with you. I wasn't quite sure what they would need from me or how I might be able to help. But the more I got to know the members of the group, the more I really admired and respected them and what they were striving for. And so started going to the national conferences, started getting more involved in things regionally. And then in, I guess it was summer of 2014, our board decided that we needed another priest in the office. And so Father Paul Check, who's my predecessor in the job I
Hmm.
have, called and asked if I would be available. So I approached my Archbishop, Archbishop Chaput at the time. First thing he said to me was, "I would never stand in the way of you doing something like that." And so I came to our central office here in Connecticut, and I've been here a little over 7 years now.
Oh, you're in Connecticut, not Philadelphia.
I'm from Philadelphia, and I'll return there. I'm still incarnated in Philadelphia, but the main administrative office for our apostolate is in Trumbull, Connecticut, which is in the Diocese of Bridgeport. Father Check is a priest of Bridgeport, so Father Harvey started the apostolate in 1980 in New York, and then in 2010, Father Check was invited by Bishop Laurie at the time, now Archbishop Laurie of Baltimore, to bring things here to Bridgeport.
Very good.
Father, as we're getting into this topic, I think for some listeners, this could be a challenging topic, but I'm so happy we're talking about it. Maybe we can start out with some just definitions. We use the term same sex attraction, but what does that mean in regard to physical, emotional attraction? Explain it for us.
Sure. So, I mean, the Catechism uses the term homosexuality and homosexual persons. The culture in which we're living generally refers to gay people or LGBT Catholics or terms like that. I think from that perspective, it's a label that kind of says too little about the person, and runs the risk um, of kind of reducing our understanding of a person, or sometimes that person's understanding of themselves, to just that part of their experience. So I would never argue with somebody. I'm not going to force somebody to say things the way that I would say them. But if I'm giving a talk or an interview like this, I'll most often refer to a person who experiences same sex attractions. And that puts the person first. It lets them describe their own experience. Sometimes we're inclined to say a person who's suffering from or struggling with. And first of all, that makes it sound like a diagnosis, but also we can't tell someone else if they're suffering or not. And if we assume that, then it may be very difficult to have a further dialogue with them. And so, same-sex attractions is an erotic attraction to a person of the same sex. Um, Eros, as a form of love, wants to be totally engaged with the other person, wants to possess and be possessed by the beloved. And so it's appropriate for marriage, where a man and a woman, because of their complementary nature, because their love can overflow into procreation, they can give a total gift of themselves. But an erotic connection is not appropriate, and certainly sexual intimacy is not appropriate between people who aren't and can't be spouses. So for a person of the same sex, a same-sex intimate action or relationship is immoral. It's not part of God's plan for our sexuality, precisely because it's lacking in complementarity, the corresponding differences between man and woman, and it's not possible to be procreative, so that their love for each other could overflow as God's does in new life.
Now,
Now,
Father, I've heard that some research suggests that with men attracted to men, it's more physical, but with women attracted to women, it's often more emotional. Is there any truth there?
well, I think it's important just to say, there's not a one size fits all explanation. And there are lots of things that we can be attracted to in another person. But I mean, I think if you look at sexual attraction towards the opposite sex and the differences between the sexes, I think it's pretty clear that in many cases men tend to be more attracted by the visual and then proceed to the emotional, and women, in terms of relationships and romance and intimacy, tend to be more focused on the emotional or the relational. And then the visual is important, the physical is important, but I think it's funny, even in the question of same-sex attractions, the complementarity of the sexes is still evident.
Hmm.
That's fascinating. So I guess the next question is, where might this come from?
I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, and I, I haven't done research like maybe some of your guests do in various aspects of their fields and their professions. Um, as far as the as far as my ministry, I've talked to lots of people and can see
Sure.
some similarities in their stories. But again, it's not as easy as kind of identifying a one size fits all predetermination. The Catechism, from a theological perspective, says that the genesis of homosexuality remains largely unexplained, and I think that's what the Catechism will continue to say, because the Church is not doing medical research; she's applying theological truths. But people who do research, for example, the American Psychological Association, if you look at their website at their questions about sexual orientation, it says that there's no consensus among scientists about any particular factor or particular combination of factors that causes a person to have a particular sexual orientation. I've also had a chance to read at least some preliminary reports from a 2019 study, the Genome-Wide Association study. Maybe you're familiar with that. That had several hundred thousand randomly selected genetic samples from places like 23andMe and the British National
Oh, sure.
Genetic Registry. And what they found was that the genetic markers that they found most often in people who reported experiencing same-sex attractions or identified as gay. I think there were 5 places in the genome that seemed significant, but they were pretty poor at predicting whether a person with one or more of those markers would be a person who identifies in this way. I think depending on the markers, between 8 and 25% of the time. So it was great to see that in the abstract, the authors of the study were very plain and very transparent. They said, there's lots more work to be done, and it's not as simple as we might think it is. It's really a complex reality, and I think we have to respect that and just ask people to share their
Sure.
stories with us.
Father, in talking to folks through your ministry, do you find any commonality in kind of the background story? People postulate things like trauma, or things like maybe having a role model who experienced same-sex attraction, or a certain family structure. Is there any commonality in the stories of the people you work with?
Well, some statistics that I'm familiar with would suggest that women who experience same-sex attraction as adults were, I think, twice as likely, 3 times as likely as women who don't, to have experienced some kind of abuse, especially sexual abuse in childhood. That men who experience same-sex attractions as adults, I think the statistics would say they're about 6 times as likely to have been the victims of abuse or traumatic experience in childhood. Again, having said that, there are lots of members of Courage who don't report any of that.
Any of that.
Who um, I often think of Leo Tolstoy in the opening line of Anna Karenina. He says, "Every happy family is the same. Every unhappy family is unhappy for its own reasons." And certainly our fundamental relationships with mom and with dad, with siblings, with peers, with teachers, with mentors, certainly those experiences should go a long way to shaping our identity, our sense of self, our sense of where we fit. And when I think most of us and most of your audience as teenagers, felt kind of disconnected, kind of out of sorts. When you throw those feelings together with the kind of swirling storm of puberty, hormones and pressures and expectations and everything else, it wouldn't be surprising that sometimes thinking about oneself in this way, or looking at peers or same-sex friends from a sexual angle, might seem to be the answer to feeling all sorts of things. So I'm really not trying to evade your questions, but I think we don't. I think it can really um, hinder our ability to serve an individual or a family with a loved one if we focus too much on these are the kind of things. Parents are already asking themselves, how did this happen, what did I do, and typically they didn't do anything out of the ordinary.
Okay, Father. So we're asking all these questions that are hard to answer. What questions should we be asking?
Well, I think first of all, one of the things that young people, especially, but anybody who's a person of faith, wants to know is, where is there a place for me in the church? Right? And I think
Okay.
the answer to that is absolutely yes. The church makes an important distinction. We were talking about attractions before. The
Right.
church makes an important distinction between actions which are immoral and feelings and emotions and desires which the church doesn't use this term, but we might call them pre-moral, right? In the sense that
Sure.
we don't choose to feel most of the things that we feel. It's a
Right.
response to the world around us. But we have to always make good decisions about where we go and who we're with and what we do, avoiding what traditionally we call the occasions of sin. But it's
Yes.
very important, I think, to say that people who experience same-sex attractions should not be marginalized for that reason, right? Should not be excluded. They're very much members of the church by their baptism, by their participation in the life of the sacraments, by their membership in the body of Christ. And so, a person who is striving to live as the church asks us all to live, the virtue of chastity, it can be fully engaged in the life of their parish, in the life of the church. Um, I think another thing to propose to them is just the beauty, and this is something I know from experience as a priest, the beauty of spiritual fatherhood or spiritual motherhood as a real vocation and not a consolation prize, not a second best way of loving. And I think it's important to to listen to the stories that people bring, whether it's having been misunderstood or treated unkindly or even harmfully by someone in the church, whether it's confusion about what the church teaches or frustration about trying to live it out. Pope Francis often says we accompany people starting from their situation and with mercy. So, if we can learn to take people's stories seriously, really hear them out before we give them what the church has to say, then there's a much bigger chance that they'll be able to receive it from a place of understanding and love and be motivated to pursue it.
Father, is it a reasonable way to consider same sex attraction as just a temptation? Like all of us are tempted in different ways, and this is one way in which people are tempted. It seems to be kind of given its own corner in
Mhm.
some ways, but is it very much different than any of the other ways all of us are tempted?
Well, I think in the sense that that many other temptations to particular sins or particular uh, ways of acting are more or less temporary. I mean, we can kind of dive deep into a bad habit or a vicious life, and we don't even experience it as a temptation anymore. It just becomes how we live. I think the reason that this is such a big question is because sexuality is really constitutive of the person, right? The Genesis 1:27 says three important things: God creates us in His image, He creates us according to His likeness, and He creates us male and female, right? And that third part, male and female, it says talks about our bodies, it talks about the sexed nature of our bodies, the complementary natures of our bodies and our spirits. It really is, I think, in a way that very few other things in life are. It's really fundamental and constitutive of who we are, first of all. And so I think it's a bigger thing than a fleeting or a periodic temptation. I think it really goes into a person's sense of himself or herself, a person's way of relating to others. And when there are questions or fears or shame or guilt surrounding it, it can really skew a person's estimation of themselves or their ability to be in healthy relationships, etc. So a lot of what we're doing in my apostolate is just hearing people out, helping them to understand God has a plan for their lives and to think of themselves in light of that plan and in light of the destiny and the dignity with which God created them, instead of just seeing their life through the lens of this particular part of their experience. So it's part of their experience, but I think it's a major major part of it, part of their sense of self and of others, and often of how God looks at them. So I think
Is
it's more than that. Yeah.
is that same-sex attraction something that is typically stable through their whole lifespan, or does it sometimes change?
Well, I mean, that's why I often speak of a person who experiences same-sex attractions in the plural,
Right.
because I think it absolutely does have the potential to change in intensity in the way that it's experienced. There's some research, for example, the National Longitudinal Study on Adolescent Health, ADD health. They asked large cohorts of young people when they were 16 and 17 what their sexual orientation was, and then again when they were 25. And what
Okay.
they found was that although people identified as heterosexual, that number remained very stable, that there was a lot of fluidity in other ways of answering that, mostly heterosexual, bisexual, mostly homosexual, uh, totally homosexual. That in every category there was some fluidity exhibited. Just I think not because of any interventions or any particular influences, other than just growing up and understanding oneself and one's relationships from a different point of view. This is why the church is always concerned about not putting a label on oneself, not defining oneself just through this experience, but particularly for young people, so that as they grow, grow in relationship and understanding of themselves and others, that they can react naturally to whatever changes might happen. Now, again, we wouldn't approach somebody who's experiencing this and say, "Oh, it's just a phase, and you'll grow out of it, or you'll get over it." No, that's just not respectful of the person's experience. But I think at the same time to just encourage people to leave room for um, just the actual desires of the heart at any given moment, rather than kind of locking them in through any particular way of assuming they'll always have to do.
Well, I think this is a good place to take a break for the first half of our interview. We'll be back with more from Father Philip Bochanski on same-sex attraction here on Dr. Doctor.
And we are back today with Dr. Doctor and talking to Father Philip Bochanski, about courage and the courage apostolate. We were debating hard or soft C before, Father, so I just wanted to attempt to get it right.
It's all good.
But tell us, for a lot of our listeners, I think, who might not have a touchstone in this world, what is courage? What does it look like? What does a meeting look like? Tell us about that.
Well, Courage was founded in 1980 at the invitation of Cardinal Terence Cook in New York. And was happening is a few years earlier, a group called Dignity had formed as a support group for Catholics who I think they would have identified as gay or lesbian at the time. But it was a very affirming of homosexual relationships and a way of looking at oneself through that label. And so it was not really consistent with, not at all consistent with the church's teaching about sexual morality and chastity. So Cardinal Cook wanted a group that would support and encourage people who wanted to live according to what the church taught. So Father John Harvey, our founding director, along with Father Edwin O'Brien, who was one of Cardinal Cook's assistant priests, now a cardinal himself, and Father Benedict Rochelle, they gathered to talk about what they might be able to provide, and then they started putting advertisements in the Catholic newspaper in New York and in other places. So our first Courage group met in Lower Manhattan on September 26, 1980. One of their first orders of business was to choose the name of the apostolate, and lots of names were proposed, including most of the theological and moral and cardinal virtues. So one of our members said, "Well, if we need to live all these things, but to live any of them, we have to have fortitude. We need to have courage." And so that's where the name comes from. Shortly after that, Father Harvey invited the members to kind of set up a plan for what they were about, and how they would strive. And so that's where the 5 goals of courage come from, which are still kind of our constitution. So first goal is to live chaste lives following the church's teaching. And then the rest of the goals support the first goal. So to to live a life of
Good.
prayer and dedication, to create an atmosphere where everyone can speak from experience and share what's going on, so that they can be kind of walk with each other, uh, to to focus on building chaste friendships both in the group and outside the group, and to give good example to others so that they can learn the same kind of freedom and joy that our members find in following the church's teaching. So a courage group meets regularly, hopefully weekly if possible, but at least once or twice a month.
So,
Meets with
Father, is this just AA for same-sex attraction, or is
the,
it different than
that's
that?
that's an excellent question. I know that Father Harvey and the first members of the group were certainly very, uh, they certainly admired and respected the 12 steps of AA. And I think in early days, our groups would have used those steps more explicitly. I think over the years, we've learned from our members that not everyone who's experiencing same sex attraction is coming at it from a history of sexual addiction, or struggling with a lot of bad habits. More and more young people are coming to our group, who maybe haven't been in relationships at all, and maybe are struggling internally, but wouldn't kind of feel drawn to an explicitly 12-step group. And so our groups focus on the 5 goals and there's a point of checking in in the course of the meeting, saying what's been going on, being accountable, but and also supportive of one another. Some major differences, there's not the same kind of, well, there's not the same role for a sponsor that there would be in a 12-step group. Really, the guide for all the members is the priest chaplain, who's there as kind of a spiritual father. um, there's not the same idea of kind of a total accounting of one's life that happens in the first step. Instead, we offer the sacrament of confession, reconciliation. And of course, we're very, very clear that our higher power that we're relying on is the triune God of the Christians, and so none of our groups are required to use the 12 steps. Some of our groups use reflections from groups like Sexaholics Anonymous, which can be useful, but our plan is always the 5 goals. So
Now,
um,
are the groups, one sex, men and women, or might they mix?
it depends on the location. Just in the general population, there's about twice as many men as women who experience same-sex attraction. So the number of women in our apostolate has always been relatively small. Um, in a place where there would be enough women to have a meeting, we encourage chaplains to have men's and women's meetings separate, at least part of the time. But I found that our men are very welcoming to women who feel comfortable joining them for a meeting. And we also have a very active online women's meeting that gathers
Hmm.
women from all over the country. And we have retreats for them once or twice a year, and that's always a joy for me to be there for that.
Father, tell us a story about, maybe if you can think of someone in particular,
Mhm.
just a story to give us an idea of how courage can help people.
Sure. Well, I mean, the stories are as varied as the individuals, of course. We have one member who was among our founding members. I think he was, if not at the first meeting, then definitely at the second, when he was in his early 20s. And he is now in his 60s. We celebrated our 40th anniversary a couple of years ago.
Wow.
Still a very loyal member of Courage, still attends meetings. It's really kind of, he describes it in terms of his family now. And I would say he'd be the first to say that he is experiencing attractions to men as often as, well, I mean, as as truly as he ever did. I think probably is troubled by them less often. He's learned to live chastely, with a lot of help and support from his brothers and sisters in Courage. So for him, it's been a support to accept, hey, this is how my heart and my mind work. This is what I'm going to feel, but I can make good decisions about it. Another member of the same group was kind of came to Courage, really not thinking he would ever tell anybody about this experience in his life. Um, Ended up opening up, of course, and having a lot of support for that. Over the years, he's kind of taking that point we were talking about before, that you just to be open to what God has in mind. Learned a lot about himself, became much more kind of comfortable in his own skin, accepting of the situation. Was very involved in his parish, and It was one of the volunteer things that he did. There was a woman around his age who was very friendly, and they got along very well. Were friends for a long time, and then realized after a while that they were feeling like more than friends towards each other. And so they've been married for 14 years now and very happy. That's not everybody's story, but some of our members do end up marrying a person of the opposite sex. Some of our members come to us after they're already in a marriage and have a spouse and children, but I've found that these attractions are getting in the way of a healthier relationship. So they come for support, often with the understanding and support of their spouse to, yeah, go and talk to people who know what you're going through, and then we'll talk about, our relationship in light of that. So I guess the beauty of the people that I'm working with and that form our Courage family is they're coming from all different walks of life, from all different stories and perspectives, but they support one another very well, I must say. And the thing that we all have in common is we're striving to hear what God's saying through the church and to embrace it and strive for it.
Tell us about Encourage.
So Encourage started not long after Courage, when words started getting out, especially in the Catholic press, and parents mostly, but other loved ones, spouses, sometimes siblings, of people who were identifying as what we would say today LGBTQ, that their loved ones weren't practicing the faith, and they had big questions about, how do I keep the faith and keep my family intact? So they reached out to Father Harvey, who would counsel them individually. Eventually, it got to be a lot of people, and he started asking some of those he had known for longer to help counsel those who were just calling. And so, between 1987 and 1992, that group kind of coalesced until at our conference in 1992, they were kind of officially introduced as Encourage, as another arm of our apostolate. So, Encourage groups meet usually monthly. Often it's many parents, but also spouses, siblings of people who are identifying as LGBT, and we give them a place to share their experience, to say things that maybe their loved one or the rest of their family wouldn't understand why they think that way or why they feel that way, and just talk it out with one another. There's a lot of listen, I was where you are now, and I did all the wrong things, but this is what I learned, and so just to share that experience and that walk together, and to kind of bring the tears and the questions and the doubts and the fears to the Encourage group, so that when they're face to face with their loved one, they can focus on affirming everything they can, keeping those lines of communication open, and just trying to build up the relationship, so that when they do have to say, well, I love you very much, but I don't agree with this choice that you're making, that hopefully their loved one can receive that as coming from a place of love, rather than trying to run their life.
So, Father, Courage, the goal is to help people live chaste lives.
Mm-hmm.
This is different than something that people hear about in the media a lot called conversion therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I feel like this has been coming up in the media more as different states in particular try and more or less eliminate that, because that's not the kind of in vogue thing right now. They think some people don't like it. Tell us what conversion therapy is and how that's very different than Courage.
Sure. Well, yeah, Courage is sometimes accused of trying to pray away the gay, or to make people straight. This is not something that the Catholic Church expects or looks for. Certainly not something that the Church or Church requires or demands, because of that nuance we talked about before. That to experience the attractions is not a sin in itself. Some evangelical, Pentecostal churches would look at that differently, and would kind of take active steps to try and quote unquote make a person straight. They would expect that the end goal is to get married to a person of the opposite sex, but that's not what the Catholic Church is about, and certainly not what Courage does. Now, the thing about conversion therapy, which is very much in the news these days, and not just in the United States, but in other countries, especially other English speaking countries, um, there's generally when that term is used, there's generally three things that people who are proposing bans on conversion therapy are talking about, depending on who they're talking to. So, for public consumption, for propaganda purposes, they'll refer to really extraordinarily hurtful things and damaging things like electroshock therapy, boot camps, aversion therapy, you know, brainwashing and things like that. And they tend to have a lot of uh, documentation, but that tends to come from journalists who will say, well, this might have happened in this case, or this happened a long time ago. You know, if those things are happening and being carried out by people who have no psychological expertise or training, you know, I'd be the first to condemn them. I don't have personal firsthand knowledge of those things happening these days, but that's certainly what is shown to the public and through the press. Now, when those same people who are proposing the bill go to the legislatures, well, the way that they propose it to them is to say, well, look, you have a responsibility to make sure that that the healthcare professionals that you license are carrying out reputable practices and are not harming people. Now, the thing is, they'll quickly say there's no good data that talking to a person, you know, talk therapy, you know, trying to help them understand their sexual attractions, trying to help them understand why they feel the way they feel and what to do with that, trying to help them to live chaste lives, that's harmful. They would say there's no evidence that it's helpful, but there's just as little evidence that it's directly harmful. Um, Nevertheless, they would kind of urge legislators to define what kind of conversations a person, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a counselor could have with their clients or their patients, and to say that, you know, this is something that we have to regulate, which is, I mean, I think it's not exactly constitutional if it regulates speech, but they would put it to the legislature in terms of regulating healthcare practice. Now, the thing is, the third aspect of this is how the laws are actually written. And I have some experience with this because our office, as I said, is based in Connecticut. There's a ban on
Sure.
conversion therapy for minors. And here in Connecticut and other places, they use a model legislation that's proposed by a group called 50 Bills, 50 States, an activist group that's trying to get this legislation passed. And so, in any legislation, the first section is typically definitions, right? And it says, in this bill, the following words mean the following things. And so, in most conversion therapy legislation, they define conversion therapy as any practice or treatment intended to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. Okay. And I think, you know, if you were to put a period there, I wouldn't have too much of a quibble with it. But there's not a period there, there's a comma, which says, including but not limited to any effort to change or modify a person's uh, behavior or expression of sexuality or gender, or to reduce or eliminate romantic or sexual feelings or attractions towards a person of the same sex. Okay, so you see what the actual agenda is, right? If I were in Connecticut, if I were to go to a Catholic high school and give a talk about chastity and say something I've already said to you, that, you know, to pursue an erotic relationship with a person who isn't and can't be your spouse is not part of God's plan, and so we ought to pursue friendship rather than romance. And someone were to ask me, well, what about me? I experience attractions to the same sex, and I would say to that person, well, a person of the same sex can never be your spouse, so definitely to try and, you know, hand those romantic feelings, those sexual feelings over to the Lord and pursue a friendship with a person of the same sex. Well, have I just made an effort to modify that person's behavior or to reduce or eliminate their romantic or sexual feelings or attractions? According to the definition, I've just done conversion therapy, right? Even though
Wow.
all I was doing was talking about the faith and morals. So I think that the real goal behind this is to take people of faith and people who want to speak about morality out of the public conversation. under the
Father, we have
guise.
3 minutes left. In our last 3 minutes, what do you wish doctors knew about the best ways to interact with patients who reveal they have same-sex attractions?
Well, I tell everybody, you should be able to say three things to someone that you care about who shares this with you. Namely, I love you, I believe God has a plan for your life, and I want to hear your story. Now, in a doctor-patient relationship, you got to tailor those to the actual relationship. To say to your patient, "Hey, I want you to know I love you." That may not be appropriate in the examining room, but definitely to listen to the story that they tell. I say to doctors sometimes, the worst thing I did, the worst decision I made was to get a skinny doctor, right? Uh, because if I have a heavy doctor, he's going to tell me I have to lose weight, but he's not going to make a big deal out of it. Skinny doctors are on my case, right? But it reminds me of how people must feel coming to confession, and
Oh,
people are going to
Yeah.
confess to their doctors long before they confess to a priest in many cases. So to be prepared to talk about, yeah, there are healthcare implications to same-sex intimate actions. There are emotional health consequences, but also emotional health situations that may be present in a person's life when they experience same-sex attractions as opposed to somebody who doesn't. So to just kind of be familiar with the research and to be able to say, hey, we really should talk about some of the choices you're making around sexuality, right? You're generally not afraid to do that in other aspects of life, but a lot of professional organizations make it different for doctors to do that about sex. But if you have a patient that comes in with COPD or emphysema, and you just prescribe them oxygen and send them home, and you never tell them they really should stop smoking, like, you're a bad doctor. Right? So if someone is doing things that are inherently risky to their physical or emotional health, and it has to do with sexuality, there's got to be a way to communicate that gently, of course, respectfully, always, taking the whole person into account. But we should, doctors and other healthcare professionals should be able to enter into that part of a person's life, because, as I say, they're going to have that conversation with their doctor long before they might turn to the church and a pastoral minister. So we're kind of all in this together. And if you're building that relationship of trust and affirmation, then that's where a person can hear good advice and take it as coming from love and not from judgment.
and people can get you at couragerc.org, correct?
That's
Father
correct.
Philip Bochanski, thank you for being with us here on Dr. Doctor.
Thanks very much.
And we're back with Dr. Doctor and the answer to the medical trivia question. Tom, what do we got?
Category testosterone. In adulthood, how many times higher are testosterone levels in men compared to women? And the average, unsurprisingly, is 15 to 20 times more in men than women. Although women do not have a negligible amount, they have some testosterone. In fact, they need some testosterone, don't they, Andrew?
That's true. A lot of people don't know that, but that is true. And what organ do they
So
come from, Tom?
in men, the testes, and in women, the ovaries. But some will also come from the adrenal glands in both men and women, and also even from some other tissues. But the vast majority, testes in men, ovaries in women. And now you know.
We thought the ovaries were just two-trick ponies, but no, they can make testosterone too. Pretty
Yes, they
incredible.
can, in addition to those valuable eggs. So, Andrew, what are our top three takeaways for this episode?
Well, talking about it off air, there are so many pearls from Father. And I'd say number one, the biggest takeaway for our listeners is to experience same-sex attraction is not a sin.
Amen.
So to experience that is not a sin. I'd say number two, the word that came to me was accompaniment. Father
Yes.
said that to everyone you meet, you should be able to say, I love you, and God's got a plan for your life, and that I want to hear your story, and you're valued. And so I thought accompaniment was the perfect word, and Father gave us a very good example of that, I'd say.
Yes.
And then really number three, at the beginning of the episode, we were really trying, we're kind of scientists in a way, being doctors, and we're looking for the data. What's this? Tell me a
Yes.
pattern. And Father was very clear. He's like, hey, everybody's got a unique story in a different way. They came here. You can't really paint with a wide brush. There's not a lot of things that necessarily like, oh, everybody must have X, Y, or Z. So I would just encourage folks who don't have a touch tone in this world, don't live in this world, I'd avoid making assumptions, because as Father said, who gets to work with folks who do experience this, everybody's got a different story. And part of accompanying them is giving them the space to have their story and to walk with them.
Right. I love the goal of courage to help people live chaste lives. We are all called to chastity, no matter our state in life. And I thought, just by the way he carried himself, he set a great example for what that sounds like. I thought it was just beautiful. I mean, he was exhibiting, to me, truth in love.
Yeah, and I was so happy that we got to highlight the Courage Apostolate for folks who don't know.
Yes.
Please check that out online. We'll have that in the show notes as well.
Yes, it's in, dozens of dioceses, most dioceses across the country, as is Encourage for friends and family members. Well, thank you for our family members of Dr. Doctor for being with us for yet another episode. You can find this and all our old episodes on our website, drdoctor.org. Just click Episode Archive near the top, and you can search by name of guest and topic over 260 episodes to date.
If you can believe it or not, we have a video version of our podcast. And if you go to our website, you can click on the YouTube link near the top of our homepage, drdoctor.org. If you don't want to just listen to us, if you want to see us, all of our facial expressions, if you have a question, you can get it at that page as well. Click Submit a Question. Check out the videos.
This is Dr. Tom McGovern.
And Dr. Andrew Mullally. And we're signing off until your next dose of Dr. Doctor.